Hi, I'm Sara.
And I'm Rena, and welcome to
Biopic, a podcast story. This is a podcast where we dissect the good, bad, ugly, and absurd of this specific genre of motion picture, the biopic. If you want to learn more about us, our scoring system, and how we choose movies, please check out our special introductory episode titled Introduction. Who are we and what are we doing?
Sara, what movie are we talking about tonight?
In this episode, we will be talking about Milk, which came out in 2008, and we originally recorded this episode in Gay Pride Month in 2024. The sound on that episode was terrible because we didn't know that we needed to turn off the air conditioning prior to recording, so we pulled the original version of it.
No matter how many times we tried to clean up the audio for that episode, it remained fuzzy. It sounded as though we were recording it in a wind tunnel on board a submarine.
This is a re-release of that content, and we're pretty excited about that because this was one of our favorite episodes. And Rena, are there any trigger warnings for Milk?
This movie contains depictions of homophobia, suicide, gun violence, and other forms of violence. We observed that Milk is the first movie we have watched in which all of the sex is consensual. Coincidentally, this is also a movie with but one major female character, if you don't count the other one, who only appears in old news footage. Sara, do you have anything to add to that?
No, you really nailed it, and that is a sad observation you just made there in regards to episode 6 of our show, Milk being the first film we watched where all of the sex is consensual. I think it's important to say under trigger warning that a number of actors who appear in this film have subsequently been quote unquote canceled for grievous behavior. While I don't want to make this particular episode of this podcast a referendum on cancel culture, I do want to mention that all of the men who have been canceled on this list have made comments to address these crimes to varying degrees of sincerity. And we'll let you be the judge on that sincerity. Some of them have also made what look like corrective choices in how they live their lives as a result of these incidents. First, we have James Franco, who has what I will describe as countless allegations of sexual misconduct against him, ranging from coercing sex from minors to running a masterclass acting workshop at his, quote, acting school, unquote, focused on doing sex scenes, and using his acting school as a way to meet women. There's a lot of fucked up stuff about him out there and about how he has used sexual power dynamics while drunk. Emile Hirsch choked a female Paramount Studios executive to such a degree that allegedly 2 people had to pull him off of her. And as a result, he served 15 days in jail as part of a plea deal where he pled guilty to misdemeanor assault. Josh Brolin was arrested for domestic abuse in 2004 in a situation that is pretty hazy with his now ex-wife, Diane Lane. And Sean Penn simply has a section on his Wikipedia page subtitled Assaults, with situations involving photographers and journalists, a songwriter, and an extra on a film. Additionally, there is an incident that has been reported around the internet transom where his ex-wife Madonna reported and then retracted a pretty garish and terrible story about being held against her will in a domestic abuse situation when she was trying to leave him.
However, hundreds of people who worked on Milk don't deserve to have their work go forgotten because of a few asshole former coworkers. We are saying this at the top so that the information can temper any subsequent mention of the offenders and any praise that we may find ourselves giving to their performances.
I also plan to shine a light on the numerous brilliant performances of actors who have proven to be unproblematic as of the recording of this episode, including Dennis O'Hare, Victor Garber, Joseph Cross, Lucas Grabeel, and Allison fucking Pill.
I loved every second of watching Allison Pill. I watched the documentary about Harvey Milk that was filmed in 1984, in which Anne Cronenberg, the campaign worker that Allison Pill plays in Milk, appears. Pill does an amazing job getting Anne Cronenberg's gestures rewound a few years to a younger, brasher version, and getting them down pat, showing the way that she seems a little bit soft-spoken, but she's actually a hard ass.
If you're going to have one female character mixed into the action, and that character is not newsreel footage and is not a garbage dumpster human, this is the character to do it with. She is a boss, and Alison Pill murders this role. And with that, any additional spoiler warnings or content warnings?
Sarah, we are going to spoil everything. Milk is a movie that spoils itself at the top by showing footage of Dianne Feinstein reading the announcement that Harvey Milk and George Moscone have been murdered and that the suspect is Dan White. The suspense is in the how, not the what. We will spoil Milk. We will possibly also spoil a number of other narrative works if we happen to bring them up and mention how their ending or major plot points play into whatever they remind us of. Consider yourself warned. Sarah, can you please tell us a little bit about Harvey Milk and his biopic, Milk?
So, from our friends at Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia online, Harvey Bernard Milk was an American politician and the first openly gay man to be elected to public office in California as a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. Milk is a 2008 American biographical film that is based on the life of Harvey Milk. It is directed by Gus Van Sant and written by Dustin Lance Black. The film stars Sean Penn, Josh Brolin, Victor Garber, and many others who we mentioned up top, problematic and unproblematic. The film was released to critical acclaim, grossed $54 million worldwide. It earned numerous accolades from film critics. It received 8 Oscar nominations, including Best Picture, and went on to win 2, Best Actor for Sean Penn, and it was his second Oscar. Milk also won Best Original Screenplay for Dustin Lance Black. Various film projects about Harvey Milk languished in production purgatory for years since the publication of The Mayor of Castro Street. Oliver Stone was planning to produce a film of it in 1991 with Gus Van Sant attached to direct and Robin Williams to star. The utterly joyless filmmaker Rob Cohen of so many things, ranging from Stealth to The Fast and the Furious, and Alex Cross was going to direct and write a film at one point. And at that time, Robin Williams parted ways with playing Harvey Milk. Some other actors considered for that version include Richard Gere, Daniel Day-Lewis, Al Pacino, and the utterly unproblematic and totally delightful James Woods.
We have 0 flattering things to say about what the Oliver Stone version would have looked like. We suspect that there would have been a giant Twinkie following Harvey Milk or Dan White around, as that film's version of Trope Navajo from our episode on The Doors, which we will get around to re-releasing at some point. But just for reference, Sarah, can you explain who Trope Navajo is?
I can attempt to explain who Trope Navajo is. Trope Navajo is literally a Native American spirit who follows Jim Morrison around, sort of like Peter Pan's shadow in the movie The Doors, after Jim Morrison maybe witnessed a car accident that involved the death of several Native Americans. And he sort of represents his pathway through the world and creativity and eventually death, and follows him around, also through death.
As if white people have not done enough horrible exploitative things to Native Americans, one has to deal with being implanted in the brain of Jim Morrison.
And also, all that James Franco would have done throughout the Oliver Stone version is complain about how Harvey was never home for dinner, because that is what the romantic partner always does in Oliver Stone movies.
Yes. I believe that at no point in Milk is Dan White ever shown eating a Twinkie.
You would be correct. They do not layer that over the film at all. I'm going to say this up front, and it's not going to be the last time. Fuck Dan White.
When I get mad at Dan White, I may just refer to him as fucking Thanos. For listeners who don't watch superhero movies, Thanos is a villain in several Marvel films, and is another role played by Josh Brolin, except that in that role, he is giant and purple, and has a chin resembling a foot.
I don't know much about Marvel movies. I do know what Thanos did, and I am not saying that Thanos is right, but you could compel me to understand Thanos' argument, whereas Dan White was simply just fucking trash. The sources we used to create this episode include an article from Looper, another article about the Twinkie thing, the book Season of the Witch by David Talbot, and the book Days of Rage by Brian Burrow, our friend who also wrote the book Forget the Alamo, When We Rise by Cleve Jones, and The Mayor of Castro Street by Randy Schiltz. And we will have all of that information in the show notes. There's a lot of good writing about what this time period was like in San Francisco and about the experience of knowing Harvey Milk, and I would encourage you to pick any of it up.
I'm going to read an interesting excerpt about Sean Penn's preparation for the role of Harvey Milk from When We Rise by Cleve Jones. This excerpt contains multiple uses of a word that Cleve Jones describes as the one word that no white person is allowed to say under any circumstances. A certain 6-letter word that starts with N, as well as a 5-letter slang derivative of said 6-letter word, said 5-letter word ending in the letter A. To avoid having to stop, apologize, and describe this word every time that it is said and every time that its slang derivative appears, I will instead make a noise in my throat that approximates the beeping noise that is used to comply with FCC regulations when someone curses during a broadcast. So, Sean Penn had taken Cleve Jones and other colleagues of Harvey Milk out to dinner. Sean Penn said, "Can I ask you some questions?" Cleve Jones writes that he said, "Sean, you can ask me anything," I replied, wondering what would come next. "You know, Cleve, I really don't know that much about gay people." I resisted the impulse to burst out with, "But you married Madonna!" "It's okay, Sean. Ask me anything." He took another deep draw of his cigarette. "So what's your..." I was confused. What did he just say? Did he just use the one word that no white person is allowed to say under any circumstances? I said, "Excuse me? What's your..." He repeated, and now I was concerned, thinking, please don't be an asshole. "I'm sorry, Sean. I don't know what you're asking me." "What's your..." "You know, like when you hear black guys greeting each other." "Are you asking me what is the homosexual equivalent of black youth referring to each other as..." Penn nodded. I considered the question and responded, "Well, that would be girl." "Girl?" He took another long drag. "Yes, but say it more like it's spelled with a U. Girl, girl, girl. And move your head around a little when you say it." Penn exhaled a plume of smoke, wobbled his head a bit, and said, "Girl." I just about choked.
God bless you, Sean Penn. You are a piece of work.
That was about the most tactless way that Sean Penn could have asked the question. And I'm wondering if it was intentional to throw Cleve Jones off guard, or if it was just Sean Penn being Sean Penn, who is a redonkulous excuse for a human being.
I have no words. I have nothing. What do you want me to say to that?
It was funny because of the reaction, "But you were married to Madonna." And then it goes off the rails.
What do I do with this information? Also, what's fun about this story is the fact that there was no smoking in restaurants by 2008, and certainly had not been smoking in restaurants for like a decade in California. So Sean Penn was just being a huge dick in this restaurant.
Yes, because he's one of the select group of people who, at least in the late aughts, could still say, "Yada yada, I'm so-and-so, and I'll smoke whenever I want." Shall we get to our walkthrough on Milk?
Yes. Gus Van Sant opens this in a really strong note by showing us the real footage and showing us this real footage and the humiliating theater that is police officers and the media going out and busting a gay bar. And as the credits end, we cut to Harvey Milk sitting at his kitchen table, making a recording to be played in the event of his assassination. Harvey Milk is super winsome. He's very charismatic. He's kind of a huge nerd. And we cut back and forth between him and this footage of him talking. We start to see his story unfold. And you see him 8 years earlier meeting Scott, who is his boyfriend for some time in the film, who is played by the aforementioned deeply problematic James Franco. He meets him on the subway in New York, and they have immediate chemistry. And this, to me personally, just like from the jump, probably the best Sean Penn performance we've seen on film, because he often comes off as very sour and cranky in both real life and in his work. But this is a really super joyful and very unself-conscious performance that he gives, and it's a really magical portrayal of Harvey Milk. Scott and Harvey immediately get into a love scene, and all of the sex scenes in this film are shot really elegantly. This one has this like referential quality to Don't Look Now or to like the Thomas Crown Affair, where you're just seeing a lot of faces and you're not seeing movement and activity, but you really feel them coming together. And after they have sex, Harvey Milk says, "I'm 40 and I haven't done anything," when they're talking about their lives. And he tells Scott that he won't make
I read that Harvey picked Scott up initially in the Christopher Street subway station. Harvey looks conservative at the beginning. He was a former Goldwater Republican. Harvey Milk campaigned for Barry Goldwater. He talked his former lover into helping him distribute leaflets for Barry Goldwater. The thing that shifted him politically was meeting more of the queer community through his boyfriends. One thing that they leave out quite rightly, because it would have been a long, snaky digression, is that Harvey Milk was involved in the production of the musical Hair. I thought they mentioned maybe one or two times too many the premonition that Harvey isn't going to live to see 50 when they just told you up top. But the 2-hour running time is so tight anyway, which I appreciated, since I think these things often go to 2.5 hours just to cram in one more thing, when they could keep that classic 120-minute running time.
I agree with you on that. This movie kicks off spectacularly and does that thing that we love, where it takes a slice of time and situates the action in that slice of time, and doesn't do a lot of narrative nonsense around trying to do all of the "I was born and then I grew up here" train track laying. Like, we get right into the action of Harvey Milk becoming the activist and the leader that he became.
I love that Milk is the story of a person who did nothing remarkable until they were middle-aged, changed profoundly, and then burned up like a Roman candle. That is not a common thing.
Yeah, I love a good getting started later in life story, because sometimes you're like, what have I even done with my life? And there's a lot that is very important and inspiring about this story. And the idea that you can pick up any day in your life and start changing, I think, is one of the more lasting lessons that Harvey Milk gave to the world.
What occurred to me is that perhaps why it took him until middle age to achieve his potential as a leader and as a world changer was because his prodigious energy was going into hiding who he really was.
And what's also remarkable is that he freed himself to stop hiding who he was. As he did that, you see how he also just continued to leverage this incredible charisma. He is a natural politician in that way that charms people, and he wins them over in spite of themselves. He and Scott moved to San Francisco, and they decide to open a camera store, and we see him meeting a fellow business owner, McConnelly, who tells them that if they're going to open, they're going to get shut down immediately for being gay. And you see him wipe off his hands with a handkerchief, and you're like, oh, look, it's garbage. But Harvey takes this as an opportunity and an opening to build something and not be afraid. He builds this haven for gay men in his camera store. He is critical in building a community rapport between gay men and other people in the Castro neighborhood. The Teamsters recruit Harvey to support their causes. And I'm about to make some obnoxious comments about San Francisco politics, a subject about which I am deeply passionate, particularly in the 70s. There's some really critical voting blocks and strange bedfellows that had to gather up in San Francisco in order to win elections. Thousands of votes could make a dramatic difference in who was getting elected. And the People's Temple, which we know that I am obsessed with, was known for being harnessed by various political movements in order to win elections, and was a really important voting bloc. So it's interesting to see how the Teamsters would see the opportunity there in bringing gay men to the table.
When you see Harvey acting as a businessman, that's the remains of him having been a Goldwater-era Republican and the old pre-1980s Chamber of Commerce, all about business republicanism, and him evolving from that to his later positions, but that's where it starts.
You see him shift that business energy, too, into being a cursed community organizer. He mentions that one thing they did to protect the gay men in the community was setting up a literal whistle-blowing system where they would wear metal whistles in order to keep men from being beaten. There was this gorgeous shot that Van Sant set up where you see an entire encounter between Harvey Milk and the police in the mirror of a whistle when he is finding out that another man has been attacked and murdered in the Castro.
In the scene in the camera store where he introduces all of the men who are gathered there individually, Harvey gives their names. And when you watch the documentaries, you can see that all of the actors in Milk worked to get the mannerisms down pat with the people they were playing, even if they weren't famous. I've been in a couple documentaries and mentioned in other people's memoirs famous, but the actors still lovingly brought that into reality. But the whole gang are individuals with personalities, even when their speaking time on screen winds up being maybe 3 to 5 minutes total.
As far as I'm concerned, Dustin Lance Black earns the Academy Award with this one sequence alone, being able to introduce all of these key players in the moment in under 3 minutes in a way that feels so unforced and so connected to everything else in this film.
It's the fastest Ocean's 11 team building I've ever seen.
So Harvey decides to run for San Francisco's supervisor because he wants to take more action to protect the community. We see different campaign positions interspersed through title cards. Again, amazing writing, super efficient. We also have our first encounter with Cleve Jones, played by the aforementioned problematic Emile Hirsch, who is, to be completely fair, absolutely outstanding in this film.
One of the criticisms of this film has been that it shows Harvey Milk as being more monogamous than he really was, but I think that his non-monogamy is alluded to by the way that he blatantly flirts when he first sees Cleve. Harvey has amazing intuition. He immediately sees something electric and valuable in young Cleve Jones, and I love the dialogue that they have here.
He likes the way those pants fit. Something we should also note here is the ages of a lot of Harvey Milk's partners. He did choose very young men. They were all age of consent, but a lot of the men he became involved with were significantly younger than him.
To headquarters, where Scott is a somewhat put-upon and uninspired campaign manager.
Is he ever? Scott is not into politics, and Harvey has to choose between being a public person speaking out for the people or being a private person and being at home.
At this point, Harvey receives his first hate letter, which contains a crude drawing.
It's not good art. I wouldn't even do it the credit of calling it outsider art, like the movie The Conqueror.
Harvey puts the poorly executed drawing on the wall and says, if it's there, we can't be afraid of it. And he and Scott go to see power broker David Goodstein. It does not go well.
This is where you get more information about the San Francisco political machine. He gets informed by David Goodstein, you can't just show up and say, I'm running and get everyone to buy into the campaign. He runs for supervisor 2 times and he loses both times. And then he runs for state assembly and he loses again. He's making a lot of really important points about the apartheid of homosexuality, but his opponent in this race for state assembly tells him that he's not giving anyone anything to believe in. He's against a lot of things, but what is he for?
Harvey's opponent in the race for state assembly, Art Agnos, is played by the artist Jeff Koons. I don't know how this piece of stunt casting happened. Agnos gives some good advice, though. Am I mistaken in thinking that Agnos is a name that we've heard around San Francisco politics?
You're not mistaken in thinking that he eventually becomes the mayor of San Francisco. He also headed housing and urban development in San Francisco. So he is definitely someone who became and remained really involved in public service in his life.
We cut back to the apartment where Harvey is making a deal with a very tired Scott that if he loses, the state assembly will be his last race. The night before the election, Harvey is walking, senses something is off, and starts running. He gets back to his camera store, and Cleve Jones has returned 3 years later.
I do love Cleve. And Harvey recruits him, and he says, "Can you assemble 1,000 people in an hour?" And Cleve Jones says, "Fuck yeah." As much as I hate that we live in a world where Aretha Franklin can't have a biopic that gets the attention it deserves, I am happy that this is also a world where a biopic of an incredibly nerdy gay man's rise in local politics can be successful.
I admire how quickly Harvey intuited that this kid could be amazing, because Cleve Jones, as portrayed here, is a live wire, a charismatic jumping bean, and a spark plug. He is constantly emitting energy and so much joy at being young and alive and making positive use of his anger.
We cut to vintage footage of Anita Bryant, who is a monster and is campaigning for protection from everyone else in society against gay men.
I'm glad that they did not hire an actress to play Anita Bryant, because it is an actor's job to be their character's lawyer, and hiring an actor might have humanized her, which she does not deserve.
Agreed. Right after Harvey loses the race for state assembly, Jim Rivaldo brings a game-changing piece of news to him. Harvey has a glimmer of hope because they are drawing new supervisor boundaries, and they are going to create a district that is the Haight and the Castro, where the demographics consist of the hippies and the gays. And Harvey will possibly be able to win this campaign and become the first openly gay man to hold major public office in California.
Scott is in the position of the trope of the partner or relative who wants the subject to leave their calling and be home for dinner. But it's portrayed more sensitively than that. Scott has been through a lot. There's one point later in Milk where Scott says, "I didn't leave the movement, I left politics," which is a fair choice for him to make, because politics is a sickening business. You have to be bonkers to want to be in politics in the first place. From a relationship standpoint, Harvey is backtracking on his promises. Scott drew a line, Harvey walked over it. I think that Harvey doesn't believe that Scott is going to walk out the door until Scott walks out that door.
Something that is done really beautifully throughout this film is the way that they layer actual local and national news coverage, highlighting these efforts throughout the country to roll back basic human rights belonging to homosexuals. And it really sets up the stakes quite nicely, and in a way that is really propulsive in the midst of all of this. And you see Harvey get a call from a young man in Minnesota who's gay, and his name is Paul. He is in a wheelchair, and he's saying, "I want to kill myself because my parents are about to send me to a program to be cured." And Harvey tells his kid, "Get on a bus and leave," and that he's not sick and that God doesn't hate him. And then the call gets disconnected, and Harvey doesn't find out what happens to Paul for a long time. And meanwhile, in the streets of the Castro, there's rioting going on about Anita Bryant and how she has successfully campaigned for gay rights to be rolled back in where else but Dade County, Florida. So you see Harvey go over to a bookcase in his apartment and pick up a megaphone. And I just love the detail that he has a megaphone in his apartment ready to go at any given time. And he goes out into this riot that is about to unfold, and he gets on a literal apple crate, and he talks about how Anita Bryants are everywhere, and that it is their responsibility to show young gay people everywhere that there is a life for them. And he says, we have got to give them hope.
This is what Harvey learned from Art Agnos. I am in awe of these activists. You see Cleve in action. I thought, how can you just run into a bar and say, "Let's go," and people follow you? Or the sheer amount of hearing "no" that Harvey laughs off. I don't understand how a person can take that much no and not be ground into a fine, dry dust.
Then we meet our new best friend, fucking Dan White, who is talking about how he's not going to be forced out of San Francisco by radicals. The rhetoric is unchanging. It's smug white people thinking that letting other people exist in the world is a sign of weakness. So it goes, time immemorial. You hear Harvey Milk talking. He is not just campaigning for gay rights. He is campaigning for the elderly. He is campaigning for education. He has a strong, essentially reformist platform, but his campaign is kind of a mess. And then who should walk into the film but Anne Cronenberg? And once again, if you want something to get done correctly, you get a woman.
I love the way that she walks in and takes charge. I love the friendship that you see forming between her and Cleve. I love the way that Harvey and Michael Wong rib each other and name call with things that people would find offensive out of context. It's dark humor to them. Anne says, I can get that San Francisco Chronicle endorsement. About this time, a kid who looks like he wandered in from The Shining, minus his twin, walks up the sidewalk to Harvey in slow motion to opera music and hands him a Dan White pamphlet.
This child, for the 30 seconds he is in this movie, has a disturbing supernatural street urchin quality to him. He walks up and he's like, yes, sir, here's a pamphlet about a bad man. I don't want to say this child is trash, but he is trash adjacent.
So, good news, Anne gets that Chronicle endorsement plus 2 other newspaper endorsements. There's infectious joy in Harvey's offices at this endorsement. Later that night, a drunk young man named Jack, who is played by the very beautiful Diego Luna, appears. Jack is the worst. I have another quote from When We Rise by Cleve Jones, which confirms in advance that Jack really was that annoying, but also in over his head and not at all cut out for being a political spouse. Cleve writes, I also met, but tried to avoid, Harvey's new boyfriend, Jack Lira. I just didn't get it. Jack was a drunk and a petulant and demanding brat, in my opinion. I didn't understand then what a miserable childhood Jack had experienced growing up in an impoverished Mexican family in California's rural Central Valley. But Jack loved dramatic alcohol-fueled confrontations, and on more than one occasion, I would hear him screaming at Harvey from their open window.
Once again, my softness causes me to have a ton of sympathy for Jack, even though he is incredibly annoying to watch. He is so clearly, just so young and has no coping mechanisms whatsoever.
I think that Jack is a rebound who sticks to Harvey like a burr.
And Harvey clearly has a thing for wounded birds, but, good news, Harvey Milk wins his campaign and he is now a city supervisor.
Hooray! Unity is beautiful. Harvey finally wins. He sees Scott out the window at his party and calls out, but nothing comes of it. Circling back, David Goodstein can't get into the party, and Cleve loves telling him that they're full. Cleve goes into the film development room with a guy to hook up, and I noted, I'm so glad that this did not get made until 2008. If you made this in 1991, there would have been no men touching each other in a movie about gay men.
Longtime Companion came out right around then, so there could have been, but it would have been segmented, I think, to art houses, and it probably wouldn't have become a mainstream film the way this did. We see a news interview where the reporter says on camera, maybe the gays are taking over, because that's the shit we hear when one person from a previously unrepresented group gets a job. We cut to a title card saying it's 1978, and we have now reached the last year of Harvey Milk's life. We see Victor Garber, also an unproblematic and brilliant actor. He shows up as George Moscone, the mayor of San Francisco, and they become really simpatico in their efforts to make changes to the city in the film. They're being sworn in. Dan White is there, and he tries to walk back some of the remarks he made during the campaign about Harvey's, quote, people, unquote, being deviant. And he's so clearly uncomfortable in Harvey's presence, but Harvey is like, I want to work with you. And we also welcome to the film the deeply talented and unproblematic Dennis O'Hare.
There is a delightful scene where Cleve arrives at City Hall on Harvey's first day, and Harvey practically tap dances up the stairs and talks about making an entrance. It's marvelous how happy and energized they are from recent victory, because politics so rarely throws joy at anyone.
Observe the joy that radiates off Sean Penn in this film. He gives such a brightly lit performance.
Leading up to this, we have some scenes where Harvey wants a gay rights ordinance so he can draw Anita Bryant to somewhere where she could possibly lose. Jack breaks into Harvey's apartment and is being needy and insubstantial. Harvey is the only supervisor who shows up at the christening for Dan White's baby. The actress playing Mrs. White does a good job of doing that simpering politician's wife thing. I managed to dislike her with not much screen time. Harvey is doing the thing where he wants to disarm people and bring them around. He tries to be friends with Dan White for a long time. There's also this fallout from the psychiatric center that Dan wanted Harvey to help him not have happen in his district.
And here comes Proposition 6, aka the Briggs Initiative. This is State Senator John Briggs, played by the aforementioned deeply brilliant and lovely Dennis O'Hare. State Senator John Briggs is virulently anti-gay and is going to lead the movement banning gay people from being teachers in California. He also has some sort of system that he really fails to explain with any clarity, by which he and others will identify homosexuals and then they will determine if they should be fired.
I love Briggs getting booed in San Francisco. I hate these fuckers. I want them to be good and over for good and never come back, and they won't go away. It's 2025 and they're still around.
When are we done? They always find a way back. Harvey does something super controversial, which is saying that everyone needs to come out of the closet, a very super complicated issue because, and I don't know what it means to come out, but I think that everyone is on their own journey and shouldn't be forced into it. And Harvey forced some people out of the closet against their will.
Cut to David Goodstein's place because he's apparently a friend now. They're talking about how to deal with the Briggs Initiative. Jack is being a terrible political spouse. He's locked himself in the closet because he is in over his head and can't handle socializing with Harvey's political associates. In keeping with my trend of being distracted from meaningful scenes by wardrobe, I love the three-piece suits that some of the men are wearing. I loved how when Harvey cuts his hair earlier in the film and started wearing a suit again, you could see that he picked out the best fitting thing in the thrift store. It looked worn, but it looked good on him. You see Cleve asking Harvey who to bring over. Cleve spells out Scott and is so happy to have the previous Mrs. Milk around again. And then we get to come out wherever you are.
As I mentioned, not about to engage in the pros and cons of it.
Scott points out that Harvey hid Scott's existence, and this is one of those things where they kind of blend Scott in with stories from some other ex-boyfriends of Harvey's, because Harvey's mother had died prior to meeting Scott, I believe. So they're meddling with the timeline in the interests of story flow, but it is true that Harvey Milk was closeted for a long time out of his life at a point before things had really begun to change at all. So he's asking people to do what he himself did not do until quite late.
It's problematic, and the film does a good job of tapping that without going too deeply into it. And then they have a birthday party for Harvey, and it is his 48th birthday.
I noticed that the birthday party sequences keep getting more elaborate.
And Dan shows up, and he's drunk and being just shitty and weird. Harvey tries to talk to him about being in the closet and coming out of the closet and why it matters, and Dan is just a dick.
At around this time in the film, gay rights ordinances are getting shot down all over the country. There's a good little Brady Bunch squares type moment of what Cleve can do with a phone call that helps make this sequence less grim. Harvey gives Cleve his magic megaphone, and they go to City Hall so that Harvey can play the hero. And they're like, yeah, we're going to stage this, and we're loving it. Cleve is not good at the megaphone yet, although he's great at gathering the crowd. And Scott takes Harvey to City Hall on his motorcycle. They're trying to get Briggs's attention. Harvey comes up with the dog poop initiative. It's been noted that in real life, Harvey Milk planted that dog poop that he subsequently steps in on camera, but I totally understand the choice to cut this from the movie, because who wants to watch someone handling poop one more second than they have to?
Yeah, this is a big who cares for me, especially in light of some of the lies that we have been told throughout history in the name of politics. You don't need to stop and show a play-by-play of how Harvey Milk planted the dog poop, and I'm glad they cut that. Politics is theater, as Harvey says. So the gay rights initiative passes. It's signed in Moscone's office, and Dan White is just continuing to be a petulant little bitch.
There was a nice moment with Scott at the birthday party. Sylvester is performing, everyone's having a grand old time, and the cake looks delicious as well as beautiful, which are two things that it is hard for a cake to be simultaneously. Scott tells Harvey, "You can do better than Jack," and there's another reflection that Harvey's not going to make it to 50. Scott and Harvey share a moment. And then after Harvey and Dan's awkward conversation just outside the party ends, Dan yells, "I don't even know who you are, Latino man," at Jack. This to me highlights that Dan is out of his depth in politics, because there were 9 supervisors and a mayor. And what kind of politician doesn't know the names of his colleagues' life partners after nearly half a year on a job? It's not Congress.
He's so mediocre in every important and unimportant way. And he also, at this point, yells out randomly, "Dan White has issues," which is a killer meme and is going to be, I think, the thing we're going to yell all the time whenever we see one of these shitty men show up in these movies, and they're trying to grind down the good people.
We are definitely making a meme for Dan White has issues, and we'll be posting that on all of our social media accounts.
Indeed. And you cannot tell me that Dan White is anything except for mediocre white trash who would be left behind by more talented politicians if he hadn't decided that he had to kill them.
Now we have our parade sequence.
Harvey is in the parade. It's so lovely. Cleve is still kind of terrible at the megaphone, but he is on fire, and Harvey helped him tap into that. And while they're at the parade, Anne Cronenberg shows Harvey a postcard with another death threat typed out on it. And she tells him that he doesn't have to go up there and make a speech, but he goes up there with, "I'm Harvey Milk and I'm here to recruit you."
Cleve has word from Moscone that Briggs is on his way there and they have to intercept. There's a brief scene of Dan complaining about naked people, and here comes Briggs.
They intercept the motorcade in like an abandoned shipyard, and Briggs will not shake Harvey's hand, and he's being super patronizing, and they agree to debate Prop 6 in front of an audience.
Briggs is forced into a handshake photo op. I love how uncomfortable he looks.
These debate sequences are amazing because you hear just how irrational the anti-gay movement is and continues to be. Briggs is talking about like gay teachers recruiting kids into being gay and all of that nonsense. And Harvey's logic is very sound, and he roundly defeats Briggs in every conversation. And he points out something afterwards where he says, "You know what? We're going to lose, but at least we'll be organized to fight back when the law passes," which is part of like the heartbreaking long game that activists have to play.
I don't know how they do it. Then they have a debate in Orange County where Briggs is on his home turf. The crowd is with Briggs and Harvey is just taking it. I don't understand how he can take it, but he's still there calling his points, and it's inspiring. Then we have a scene where they're about to vote on that dog poop ordinance, and Jack is being needy and unsupportive again. Harvey has another argument with fucking Thanos at around this point.
And then Jack kills himself.
Harvey goes home and Jack is dead after leaving a ton of manipulative suicide notes. Jack hung himself. I've been really hard on this kid.
He had no tools with which to deal with all of this shit that he was going through as a young gay man and as someone who has been thrust into the spotlight with a much older partner.
Harvey mentions to Dan that even Ronald Reagan is against Prop 6.
We know how bad it must be for Reagan to be against it. Jimmy Carter is, of course, on the right side of history here. Fantastic human being. not great at the job of president. And they're watching the votes come in and are seeing Prop 6 winning districts and are becoming really concerned as Harvey is sitting there. And he, at this point, gets a follow-up call from Paul, the young man in the wheelchair who had spoken with him so much earlier in the film. And Paul tells him, I did get on that bus. I came to Los Angeles and I found people. And one of them happens to be a close friend of Harvey's. And Paul passes the phone over and he tells Harvey that vote no is winning in Los Angeles, and you feel the beauty and triumph of this hard-won moment. In the back of your mind, you know that immediately there's a bunch of miserable monsters who are planning how they're going to pull it back.
This scene is pure joy. And then Dan is watching TV. Dan resigns because Dan is, of course, bitter.
And Dan is bitter because he's not making enough money. He's only making about $9,000 a year with change, which is about $3 trillion in 1978 money. And he's annoyed that he's being left behind like the sad, big, fucking unstable baby that he is, and fuck him. And it's always the shittiest hobgoblins who drag down our brightest stars.
The city supervisor's salary is quoted at $9,600 in 1978, which translated to $46,166.58 when we first recorded this episode in June of 2024. Not quite enough to comfortably build a family in a major city, but Dan White is still a horrible human being.
Gosh, Dan, maybe your wife could be supportive by getting out of the house to get a job instead of putting all of her effort into simpering. And I know it's going to go against some of your family values and stuff, but if you can't make it work, have someone else get a job.
Fucking Thanos has resigned, but then the cops call him into their little side office because they don't want their guy to resign. This is the point where Harvey finally turns on Dan. This is also the point where the lack of Jonestown turning up here in the story is telling. It would have explained why Moscone might have been in this state of mind where he was too frazzled with everything to handle the Dan White situation with the finesse that he otherwise displays, which I guess is a bit of victim blaming, but I thought I'd mention it. Harvey has completely given up on Dan, rightly, and he's telling Moscone, we won't back you. Moscone tells him, you know who you sound like now? Boss Tweeter Mayor Daley. And Harvey is happy about this and reflects that a homosexual with power is something new. And then we cut to the opera.
So Dan White IRL was pissed off that his resignation got pushed off the front pages of the local newspapers. And that was because 900 San Francisco residents were murdered by Jim Jones in a foreign country. I don't think it's victim blaming to point out that Moscone spent the last days of his life distracted and devastated by this. It's absolutely a very good reason that he wouldn't have been all that concerned with Dan White's fucking feelings.
I mean, nobody's feelings matter except for the feelings of straight white men. Isn't that what we learned in 2024?
That's what we've been learning the whole time. Sometimes we just forget, but it is the most important thing. It's the only thing.
Yeah, it's fuck your feelings unless you're a straight white cis man.
Exactly.
So back to this wonderful movie from 2008 when we were hopeful about the future. Harvey is at the San Francisco Opera House watching Tosca. He's there in the company of a singer that he loved seeing 30 years earlier. Dan White learns that he is not being reappointed. Harvey calls Scott in the wee hours. It looks like they're reconnecting. And then we see Dan White breaking into the city hall through a window so that he doesn't have to go through the metal detector because he's special.
Well, also, the metal detectors were set up because of Jonestown and the threat of People's Temple members maybe coming into City Hall to possibly try and assassinate people.
They're cutting back and forth between City Hall and Harvey on the phone with Scott. Scott tells Harvey that he's proud of him. And it's a way that Scott does not fit the mold of the cliched partner who wants you home for dinner. Moscone is telling fucking Thanos to be reasonable, and we hear the sound of Dan White shooting Mayor Moscone.
Harvey shows up at work through the front entrance, and he goes to see Dion Feinstein, who apparently IRL did not get along that well with Harvey Milk. And she tells him to avoid Dan because she doesn't want a scene, because they are going to make sure that Dan understands that he is going to remain resigned.
Dan asks Harvey to step into his office. As I was watching this, I was saying, don't to the screen. Things slow down as they can mentally in moments of panic. Harvey dies looking at the opera house through the window of his offices, the opera house where he'd been happy a short time earlier. The small shred of grace is that he dies looking at something he loved, not at Dan White.
You don't see Moscone getting shot directly. You see it through reflections in glass and mirrors. You also see Harvey's shooting happen in the reflection of the windows. It's very heartbreaking to see the way he is executed by this piece of shit garbage person. And then Scott and Anne are together at a brief ceremony at City Hall, and then they walk out and join the real celebration of Harvey Milk's life, which was just lines of people marching peacefully with candlelights.
His Cleve has an expression of shock and determination on his face that I found stunning.
And you hear these beautiful, for the sake of this film, final words when he says, "If there should be an assassination, I want 1,000 to rise. If a bullet should enter my brain, it should destroy every closet door. It's about the us's out there without hope. Without hope, life is not worth living. So you and you and you gotta give them hope. You gotta give them hope." The writing is so exquisite, and the way that they take pieces of what Harvey said over the years and insert it into the film and use it to tell this story is incredibly moving. And you hear these words right after you've seen him be assassinated by this garbage piece of shit dude who ends up serving 5 years for, I believe, involuntary manslaughter. Dan White is trash. Maybe he was a good dad. Maybe he was a good husband. I don't know. And it doesn't really matter to me. He killed 2 people who were going to change the shape of politics, and you're garbage.
With that, it is time for choice dialogue. Some of these aren't actually from the screenwriter. These are real quotes from Harvey Milk. The things that I wrote down are, "If they try to kill me, I'll get the sympathy vote. And of course, if a bullet should enter my brain, let it destroy every closet door." I also loved, "The polls were way off. Briggs is going down by 2-1. I loved that line because that is how I wish it would always turn out when polling makes me sad. It was a satisfying piece of wish fulfillment that made me feel good.
It's not screenwritten, but it's what Harvey would say. And I loved all of the times when he just got up and he said, "I'm Harvey Milk and I'm here to recruit you." Dustin Lance Black wrote a fantastic screenplay, and he deserved every honor he received for it.
Milk is an amazing film. It was an easy E in Straight Outta Compton level of crying before we knew what an easy E level of crying was.
I'm getting very emotional just rereading these lines and just kind of re-feeling the film as we're talking through it, because it is so beautiful and inspiring. And I guess it's time for us to rate the movie.
Ratings time for outward appearances, which is hair and makeup, etc. I gave Milk a 9.5 instead of a 10, only because there may be things coming up like The Elephant Man, where makeup artists have to do more than just be really good at making actors resemble the people they're playing in a period authentic way.
That's very fair. I gave it a 9. These people look and feel accurate, and they did it in a really nice, non-stagey way. Everyone looked really exactly right, although I did have some complaints in my head about Cleve Jones's wig.
I did not care for James Franco's wig in the early scenes.
I feel stupid for even calling it out, because who really cares what I think about the wig, honestly?
Acting and casting.
Acting and casting, I gave it a 10. The acting in this film is so good from top to bottom.
I also gave it a 10 out of 10 for acting and casting.
For passage of time, I gave it a 9. You never didn't know what time it was, whether because of the fashion, because of the hair, because the movie was telling you in ways where you knew where you were and what you should be expecting.
I gave it a 10 for passage of time. Next, costuming. For costuming, I gave a 9. Everything looks right. They even go into the things that are embarrassing, like the way that extreme bell-bottoms looked silly on grown men. The reason I gave it a 9 is because there are going to be things coming up where it is in another century where you have to make an enormous amount of really elaborate things from scratch, things that just plain take more work than doing the 70s. I have to reserve 10 for the big costume dramas and cases where someone like Sandy Powell or Edith Head or Margaret First was in charge.
That's fair. I give it a 9 also. Everyone looks so gritty and you can practically hear the swish of the polyester.
Quality of the script, I gave a 10. It's one of the best we ever did on this show.
Same. This absolutely deserved to be among the best screenplays of that year.
Accuracy, I gave it a 7.25 because it was, relatively speaking, more accurate than Coal Miner's Daughter, which got a 7, but there were still a lot of things that were off about it. I have some things to read here in defense of the accuracy. For example, the idea projected here that Dan White was closeted. And in terms of where the idea came from, the screenwriter said in an interview with Terry Gross in November of 2008 on NPR's Fresh Air, quote, "Well, that came from several accounts where Harvey said that to friends and coworkers in City Hall. He mentioned it to a newspaper at one point, but it was all in the last couple of weeks. You know, there's no proof of what Dan White's sexuality was. I don't really have a strong opinion of that. I can never know. I will never know. You know, Dan White was in over his head at City Hall. He's a very sad man, I think. Whether it came from being closeted, I'm not sure. I'm really not sure." Milk thought of another supporting example of what the real Harvey Milk thought came from Randy Schultz in The Mayor of Castro Street, where Harvey and his friend Doug are at City Hall. And Doug asks, "Who's that?" "That's Dan White," Harvey said. "He is a real closet case." Every trace of Milk's usual good humor dropped from his voice. "There's nothing more dangerous than a closet case, someone fighting that inside of himself. He's much more hostile to anyone who is open." Doug mentioned that he thought Dan White was cute. "Dan White is a closet case," charged Milk, "and he's dangerous." The point here is that Harvey thought so, that he repeated it to friends and coworkers in City Hall, and that we're seeing the action of the film through Harvey Milk's eyes, even if it is purely his reaction, and others repeating his words. The stretch that Harvey suspected that Dan White was in the closet, and the idea that this movie inaccurately implies that Dan White was a closeted gay man, is in itself a testament to the strength of Sean Penn's performance, because we're on Harvey's wavelength.
Accuracy for me is a 7. I reflected on it that they never really bring home the point that Dan White was a closeted homosexual. It is all implication, and it is, to your point, the strength of Sean Penn's performance. And we're never going to know that. Dan White's problem, and what we do know about Dan White, is that he used a garbage defense to get out of being sent to prison for the rest of his life for murdering 2 people. He was clearly a mediocre, miserable person who was being eclipsed by more talented people. Also in the accuracy department, something that was swirling in the background along with Patricia Hearst and the fact that the city of San Francisco was experiencing bombings from little weird like post-1960s militia groups like every 17 days, whether it was a Weathermen or the Symbionese Liberation Army or some other random groups. The city of San Francisco was in a really messy place in the 1970s, and Jim Jones was a part of that, and he was incredibly interwoven into the world of City Hall. And I don't think you could nod to it without going really hard on it. And I don't think that it's necessarily an oversight to not have it in here, but it is an accuracy thing, and it's not a flaw in the writing. Anytime you add Jim Jones to your soup, he's a really strong ingredient to throw in there. And if you're going to drag him out into your story, it's very difficult not to make it more of a Jim Jones story. And if you add to that the 900 people that were murdered by Jim Jones, it does get really messy, particularly if you look at Harvey's relationship with Jim Jones and Moscone's relationship with Jim Jones. And there's some controversial history about Harvey outing people. For example, Oliver Sipple, who saved Gerald Ford from his second female-led assassination attempt in 3 weeks in San Francisco by Sarah Jane Moore. The movie touches on that in a scene with Joseph Cross, but it doesn't go in deep there. And it's a complicating factor in Harvey's legacy, but it also comes from that place of a militant effort to make homosexuality accepted in society.
Harvey personally knew Oliver Sipple, who was the ex-boyfriend of one of Harvey's ex-boyfriends, but Harvey sort of ruined Oliver Sipple's life with that outing. In terms of the accuracy regarding Jonestown being left out, it connects to my thoughts about the difference between lying by omission and editing for story flow and focus. There's a world where you can do Jonestown justice, and that's one where you have a one-season prestige drama following the story of the 1978 San Francisco Board of Supervisors. I would watch that show. There, you could have a drama focused on Milk and Moscone that includes the full story of how Moscone's last days were haunted by Jonestown. You would have the space to do a nuanced portrayal that non-judgmentally places Harvey and the pre-AIDS gay community's attitude toward monogamy in a historical context. In that format, you could look at Gordon Lau, the first Chinese supervisor, Carol Ruth Silver, the first single mother elected to the board, Ella Hill Hutch, the board's first Black woman, and Dianne Feinstein, always getting undeserved hate from all over the political spectrum for being unable to please 100% of the people 100% of the time, despite being a fucking trailblazer. And you can have baby Nancy Pelosi pop in for a cameo because her brother-in-law Ron also served on that board. You could also show the full rich tapestry that is the story of the 1978 San Francisco Board of Supervisors in that one-season prestige drama, but you can't do that in a movie called Milk without slogging it down. I'm drawing a line between lying by omission and sticking to focus. Milk was sticking to focus.
Fair enough. And I would add to your prestige drama series, there's also a tight, excellent Aaron Sorkin movie in here about the 10 days that shook San Francisco. Jonestown happened 10 days before Harvey Milk and George Moscone were assassinated. Dianne Feinstein had to essentially take over the city. She had been planning to retire. She had her own personal rise to power and responsibility as a result of all that was happening in that city during that time period. She for sure has a complicated legacy, but she was also absolutely a trailblazer, and she was a hero to that city, saving it from itself during a really, really dark time period.
Gosh, okay. Next, storytelling.
Was it cliched? Was it interesting? Was it inventive? And I gave it a 9. There were cliches as always, and I'm going to allow them because it was all in service of keeping the movie in motion, and it helped us to understand all the context of the world that Harvey Milk was in and how he became an activist.
I gave Milk a 10 for storytelling. For direction production, I gave it a 9 because they could have done with 1 or 2 fewer mentions of Harvey not turning 50, and also because they didn't have to simplify what is incorrectly known as the Twinkie defense in the closing credits. It wound up being a flaw in the film where naysayers could say, but here's something that wasn't quite right. I think you're good enough. It's okay to tell and not show when you're giving information via cards over closing credits. They could have fine-tuned that better.
And that's fair. I gave direction and production decision-making a 9 because, as you pointed out, they go really hard on the whole I'll be dead by 50 thing in a way that's kind of weird for a movie that is otherwise so nuanced.
I agree with you. Reflecting on that for Do We Care, I gave it a 10.
Yep, same, 10. This is a really important movie. It is also really entertaining and engaging. There are important movies, capital I, important movies on our list that are not entertaining, that are not enjoyable to watch, that are not moving, that do not feature radiant performances at their center, but are important. And Milk manages to pull off all of that.
With that, Sarah, I already did my average. It came to 9.475, but I am using my buy because we know that if something is pulled above 10, it will cancel down to 10. We are never going to get a score above 10. I felt it was so important that Milk get 10 out of 10 because it is on my short list of my 3 favorites and an honorable mention that I described in the Who Are We and What Are We Doing introductory episode when you asked me about my favorite biopics. So mine comes to 10.475.
I came out with a 9, and I am going to use my buy as well because the experience of watching this movie again was so delightful and singular.
We don't need to average those out because Milk is getting 10 out of 10. Milk deserves 10 out of 10, and it gets 10 out of 10. Wow, that feels good.
I'm with you on this. Milk gets a 10 out of 10, and it does feel very good. And I'm sure they've been waiting for us to give them their final award. And that also means that this qualifies for second opinions on IMDb, the show element that we blatantly ripped off from How Did This Get Made because we love it so much.
First one out of 10 stars, titled Sorry, Not For Me, by Eliza Gaskell on January 20th of 2011. Sarah, would you do the honors?
So Eliza Gaskell writes, I tried very hard to watch Milk as Sean Penn is a very good actor and he deserves an Oscar or two. But I could just not get into this film. About 10 minutes into the film, I found my mind wondering about what I was going to have for dinner. About 20 minutes into it, I got bored and restless. Then I started tapping my feet. I really need to go to the shop to get bread, coffee, and something for my dog. And the story was very interesting, truthful at first glance, which is why I purchased a ticket with my friends. I guess it lagged in some areas and slowed to a crawl in scenes. Not sure whether it was the screenwriter's fault or the director. Sadly, I lost interest in the movie and prayed it would hurry up and end. Toilet break was a blessing. Even visiting the food stall levitate the zombie-like state I was in. I could have escaped and ditched my pals, but good friends are hard to find. Everything was excellent. The cast, the costume for the time this movie was set in, lighting, and even the acting. Still, I'd rather watch paint dry than watch this movie. Wish I can give it more credit, but honestly, I can't. This film was not for me.
Want to know what you think of this review, Sarah?
First, shout out to the lighting crew. I failed to mention that the lighting was outstanding. This is a confounding review. I will give her credit for acknowledging at the end of the review this film was not for me, but why wait to the end to say that after you've talked about needing to go shopping, get something for my dog? And I wonder what that something ended up being. And it's weird because she does say a lot of nice things, but she hated it.
She says so many nice things that this feels like it should be a 3 out of 10 review, not a 1 out of 10 review.
What's also interesting about this review is that it does boil down to it not being a movie for her, but then why go on the internet and talk about that? Like, why? Why?
The next low review, titled Had to Turn It Off, gives Milk a 3 out of 10.
This is coming to us from Girl K894531339. Due to the very, very annoying loudness of the opera music, period, you watch a movie at a certain tone, then all of a sudden the opera is blaring. Too bad it ruined the mood to continue watching it. This sometimes happens with movies. I don't know why they didn't catch this when they made it. Not everyone wants to listen to the distraction of loud opera singers yelling during a movie. Such a shame. Though I do like Sean Penn ever since the movie Bad Boys. He's a pretty good actor. So I guess playing someone out of his typical roles must have been amazing. Maybe one day I'll try and watch it with the music turned down. But anyone seeing this, please watch how you add music to your movies. It's not really needed. I went through the first 35 minutes having to turn down the audio like I do with the hundreds of commercials I hate. So, as with the last review, I had to note that we failed to shout out the lighting people, and I failed to critique fairly the sound design team, and I apologize for that. Is IMDb actually this girl's live journal? I don't recall the opera music being too loud, and I would say that it's one of the things that's really interesting about sound design is that good sound design is that you're not noticing it, and I didn't notice it. So I guess it wasn't a problem for me, and I'm not saying that this problem wasn't very real to Girl K89-4531339, but I am saying that I went to school for film and I didn't have a problem with the sound design. Rena, do you have anything to add?
I did not find the opera music overly loud either. I believe that most or all of the opera used in Milk was from Tosca, which was the last opera that Harvey Milk saw, a masterpiece that he loved. I felt that all of the musical choices were quite good and did not notice any of them as being overly loud.
Rena, this may not be a good place to open up this conversation, but was Tosca really that good? I am being
Sarah!
I'm being sarcastic. Oh my God, I'm joking. I trained as a singer early in my life. I object heartily to the description of opera singers as yelling. I know what bad singing sounds like. This was not bad singing, and it certainly didn't qualify as yelling. And I reject that comment on its face as completely inaccurate. She is, like so many of us, entitled to her opinion, and I don't doubt that this was very real to her, and I'm sorry that it made her turn off the movie and that the sound design clouded her ability to enjoy this film. I also like Sean Penn's pretty good at acting. Both of these reviews kind of do damn Sean Penn's acting with really faint praise. Like, I guess he deserves an Oscar or two, and I'm like, he's got them. He's all set. He even gave one of them to Zelensky to hang on to until the war is over. Like, he's that confident in his Oscar possession. And then her with Sean Penn's pretty good at acting. Like, way harsh IMDb reviewers.
In regards to the reviewers who said that the acting was merely pretty good, I have a quote that refutes this from the same Terry Gross interview from November of 2008, which ran on NPR's Fresh Air. Dustin Lance Black said of Sean Penn, I know that on those first days of shooting, when he's completely transformed and he's got his hair done and he's in that old secondhand suit, Cleve Jones and Anne Cronenberg were on set, you know, the real life people who were sort of Harvey Milk's proteges, and they had to leave the set. Cleve had to go out and get a cigarette because it was just uncanny.
Did Terry Gross take the time to ask Dustin about the sound design? Because it would have been a good time to bring up the issues around that. I read some other dissenting opinions about the film on IMDb, and we didn't include it, but I did want to shout out to the reviewer who said, why is Cleve Jones even here? The complaint was basically that Cleve Jones just shows up and isn't really important. And I thought, what did you watch?
I have no idea.
It's so interesting to read these reviews because this entire world is filled with fascinating people who see things so differently than some of us. And it's a reminder of the magic of living in these over-interesting times.
So with that, we should wrap it up. I wanted to highlight what you see in those early scenes. Those attitudes are unfortunately still with us, and that the gains of the past two generations are more precarious than we want to countenance. Because if Roe v. Wade could fall, any Supreme Court ruling could fall, but in terms of looking at the world at large, homosexuality is still illegal and punishable by death or imprisonment in over 60 countries around the world. And to learn more about that, I would recommend going to equaldex.com, which rates countries around the world on a scale of 1 to 100 for tolerance. And that website is https://www.equaldex.com. Is there anything more that you wanted to say about Milk, Sarah?
It's an absolutely gorgeous movie. It is a masterpiece of a biopic. See it, read about Harvey Milk, be the change you want to see. This is my completely and totally naive, hopeful message after rewatching this film.
Beautiful. If you liked our show, please leave us a 5-star review on the iTunes store, wherever you get your podcasts. And please tell a friend, or better yet, plural friends.
Visit us on our website, Podbean. Podbean. It's www.podbean.biopicapodcaststory.com, where you can see all of our previous episodes and our ratings for each of those episodes. We also have a Blue Sky and an Instagram profile where we post things from the show, as well as visual content to support each episode. We recently launched a Patreon page to help us defray some of the small expenses that we accrue in bringing this show to you. Next time, maybe we'll try and rate some piece of shit movies so that we can just go off on it for laughs, like The Alamo.
This is episode 6, or the re-release of it. Episode 7 is Bessie with Queen Latifah as Bessie Smith and Monique as Ma Rainey. It's not a piece of shit. It was pretty decent, but if you're listening to this at the point that we release it, this redo of episode 6, the next episode due out is Coco Avant Chanel, which we'll be doing with fashion journalist Roxanne Robinson, who I once interned under at Women's Wear Daily.
That is going to be a fun episode. And unlike Bessie, which, spoilers from the future, you had a lot of problems with the jewelry in that film, if I recall correctly.
The emerald earrings looked like they came out of a Cracker Jack box.
And I got out my conspiracy board to try and figure out why this movie existed and Bruce Beresford's role, and also possibly connecting it back to Driving Miss Daisy. So it's kind of a party. I also go a little hard on my praise for Queen Latifah, who is a fine performer, but I maybe went a little hard on that. Went too deep on my praise for Queen Latifah. I've been apologizing for that for months.
Yeah, you've been berating yourself for this since last summer, and it was an early episode. We didn't know what we were doing. It's the reason why we have to record this, because of all the stuff we didn't know when we started.
Very true.
So with that, thank you everyone for listening in.
Yes, thank you. And see you soon. And Rena, have a wonderful evening.
You too, Sarah. And good night to the earnest and the cynical.
Good night.